Edward Blackwood roared with laughter from his gilded wheelchair. "I'll give you $1,000,000 if you cure me," he mocked the nun who offered a blessing. Sister Grace touched his legs with precise technique. What Edward felt at that moment froze his laughter forever. Sister Grace Miller walked through the hallways of St. Joseph's Hospital with serene steps, carrying her small prayer bag and a genuine smile that seemed to light up the darkest rooms. At 42 years old, she dedicated her Thursday afternoons to visiting patients who often hadn't received visitors in weeks. Her mission was simple but powerful: to bring spiritual comfort to those most in need of hope. On that specific day, the sky heavy with grey clouds mirrored the melancholy that hung over the neurology floor, where the most complex cases were treated with the technical coldness of modern medicine. Edward Blackwood had occupied the hospital's most luxurious room for 3 months. Ever since a car accident had completely changed the course of his life at 55 years old. Known throughout the city as the most successful real estate mogul, Edward had built a financial empire based on aggressive negotiations and a personality for whom impossible was not in his vocabulary. His fortune was estimated in hundreds of millions, but all that money couldn't buy what he desired most: to feel his legs again and walk through his company's offices as he had for decades. Edward's room was an extension of his office, filled with monitors, phones, and stacks of documents that he insisted on signing even in his condition. The walls were decorated with expensive paintings and exotic flowers brought daily by his secretary, in a desperate attempt to maintain some normalcy amidst the emotional chaos his life had become. He had fired 3 physical therapists in 2 weeks, claiming incompetence, but the truth was that Edward couldn't stand being treated like a common patient after a lifetime of bossing everyone around him. When Sister Grace gently knocked on the half-open door, Edward was shouting on the phone with one of his partners about a contract that had been lost in his absence. He violently hung up the phone upon seeing the nun's figure standing at the entrance, his dark eyes gleaming with a mixture of accumulated anger and despair. Her presence there represented everything he feared most: the confirmation that his situation was so dire that even nuns were coming to offer the last rites. Edward had rejected visits from priests, pastors, and other religious figures in previous weeks, always with harsh words and impatient gestures. Sister Grace entered the room with the tranquility of someone who had faced similar situations hundreds of times during her 15 years of religious life. She observed Edward in his custom wheelchair, made of precious materials and equipped with cutting-edge technology, a stark contrast to the simplicity of her brown habit and time-worn sandals. Edward looked at her with a dismissive expression she knew well. It was the look of someone who had lost faith not only in God, but in all forms of human kindness. She approached cautiously, noticing how his muscles tensed with each step she took towards him. Sister Grace offered a blessing with soft words, explaining that she used to visit patients to offer spiritual comfort, and that she had heard about his situation through one of the nurses. She spoke of hope, of the strength that comes from faith, and of how life's greatest challenges can often transform into opportunities for spiritual growth. Edward listened with growing irritation, interpreting every word as cheap pity and religious condescension. When she finished speaking and extended her hands to bless him, Edward erupted into a bitter, cruel laugh that echoed through the room like the roar of a wounded animal. Edward's laughter was laden with months of frustration, anger, and a deep pain that he refused to admit. It was the laughter of a man who had lost everything he considered important, and who now saw in the nun's presence a confirmation of his invalid condition. In that moment of despair disguised as arrogance, he uttered the words that would change both their destinies forever. Edward Blackwood wasn't born rich, but from a young age, he displayed a fierce ambition that set him apart from everyone around him. The son of a small hardware merchant, he grew up observing how money changed the way people were treated, and he swore to himself that one day he would be the one to dictate the rules of the game. At 25 years old, with a loan that jeopardized his entire family, Edward bought his first plot of land and built a small house that he sold for a profit in just 3 months. This first victory fueled a thirst for power that would grow exponentially over the following decades. For 30 years, Edward built his real estate empire based on a simple but ruthless philosophy. Everything had a price, and he was always willing to pay more than any competitor to get what he wanted. He bought land in areas considered worthless, patiently waited for urbanization to arrive, and then sold it for astronomical prices. His company, Blackwood Developments, became synonymous with luxury and exclusivity, constructing condominiums that only the city's elite could afford. Edward prided himself on never having lost a negotiation and on being feared by competitors who knew his reputation as an inflexible and calculating man. Financial success brought with it an arrogance that Edward cultivated as if it were a business tool. He sincerely believed that money could solve any problem, buy any person, and open any door that was closed to him. In business meetings, Edward often made offers so generous they became impossible to refuse, always accompanied by a confident smile that made clear his certainty of being in absolute control of the situation. Employees, suppliers, and even municipal authorities knew that Edward Blackwood got what he wanted, and many bowed before his financial and political influence. His personal life reflected the same philosophy. Edward had married 3 times, always to younger women attracted by his wealth, and all relationships ended when they realized he was incapable of offering anything beyond material comfort. He had no children because he considered children an investment with uncertain returns, and he had emotionally isolated himself from anyone who could represent a vulnerability in his business. Edward lived alone in a sprawling 21,500 square foot mansion. Surrounded by employees, he treated more like equipment than human beings, all knowing they could be fired at any moment if they didn't meet his expectations. The accident that changed his life happened on a rainy March night when Edward was returning from a meeting that had sealed the most lucrative deal of his career. He was driving his imported car at an imprudent speed on the interstate when a truck lost control and collided sideways with his vehicle. Edward vaguely remembered the glass shattering, the metal twisting, and a searing pain that shot up his spine like a bolt of fire. When he woke up in the hospital 3 days later, the doctors explained with clinical coolness that his spinal cord had been severely compromised and that the chances of him walking again were practically non-existent. In the first few days after receiving the diagnosis, Edward reacted the only way he knew. He tried to buy a solution. He brought in the best specialists from the country and even abroad, offering absurd sums for experimental treatments and surgeries that didn't even exist yet. When the most renowned doctors confirmed that his condition was irreversible, Edward entered a spiral of denial and rage that transformed him into an even more bitter version of himself. He fired employees for insignificant details, broke lucrative contracts on a whim, and began treating everyone around him as if they were responsible for his condition. The gilded wheelchair that Edward had specially commissioned for him was more than a means of locomotion. It was a symbol of his refusal to accept anything that wasn't perfect and expensive. Made with a gold alloy and equipped with state-of-the-art technology, the wheelchair cost more than many people earn in an entire decade of work. For Edward, it represented his determination to maintain control over at least some aspects of his new reality. But for all who saw it, it symbolized the futility of trying to buy dignity and acceptance. "I'll give you $1 million if you cure me," Edward shouted with a laugh that echoed through the room like the sound of something being broken forever. His words carried decades of certainty that any problem could be solved with enough money, but they also revealed the deep despair of a man who for the first time in his life faced something his fortune couldn't buy. Sister Grace remained silent for a few seconds, observing Edward's eyes with a compassion he couldn't comprehend, as if she saw through the armor of arrogance he had built around his pain. Without asking permission and completely ignoring the insulting offer, Sister Grace approached the wheelchair and knelt beside Edward with a naturalness that completely disconcerted him. She extended her hands towards his legs with precise and confident movements, as if she knew exactly what she was doing. Edward tried to push the wheelchair away, but something in the nun's serene determination made him hesitate. He watched, intrigued and annoyed at the same time, as she positioned her palms over his knees and began making movements that clearly weren't just religious gestures of blessing. Sister Grace applied a specific neural mobilization technique she had learned during her years of physical therapy training before entering religious life. Her fingers found precise points along Edward's legs, applying calculated pressure in sequences that followed complex neurological patterns. She worked in silence, focused, moving her hands along his atrophied muscles with an expertise that contrasted drastically with her humble appearance. Edward initially tried to protest, but something in her technique awakened sensations he hadn't experienced in months. The first sensation Edward felt was like a distant, almost imperceptible tingling that started at his hips and slowly traveled down his thighs. His eyes widened in shock when he realized he was actually feeling something beyond the complete numbness that had become his reality. The tingling evolved into a more defined sensation, as if small electrical currents were being reactivated along neural pathways that doctors had declared dead forever. Edward looked at Sister Grace with a growing expression of disbelief, his breathing becoming irregular as he tried to process what was happening. Sister Grace continued the procedure for a few more minutes, alternating between neural stimulation techniques and specific manipulations aimed at reactivating dormant connections between the brain and the lower limbs. She worked with the concentration of someone who had dedicated years to studying the human body, but also with the faith of someone who believed that miracles could happen through knowledge and dedication. When she finally stopped and removed her hands from Edward's legs, the silence in the room was deafening, broken only by his heavy breathing and the distant sound of movement in the hospital corridor. Edward looked at his own legs as if seeing them for the first time, trying to process the sensations that continued to pulse through muscles he had considered dead. He tried to move his toes and, to his absolute surprise, felt an almost imperceptible movement that made his heart pound. It wasn't full movement, not even functional movement, but it was infinitely more than any doctor had managed to elicit in months of treatment. Edward raised his eyes to Sister Grace with an expression that mixed gratitude, fear, and deep shame for having treated with such contempt someone who had just given him a spark of hope back. The laughter that had echoed through the room minutes before now seemed to belong to another man, a version of Edward that existed before that moment of revelation. He realized he had offered money to someone who possessed something far more valuable: real knowledge, genuine compassion, and the courage to apply her talents even when facing hostility and contempt. The cruel laughter had frozen on his face, replaced by an expression of humility Edward hadn't shown in decades, as he began to understand that he was in front of someone extraordinary, disguised in the simplicity of a religious habit. In that transformative moment, Edward Blackwood began to understand that perhaps there were things in the world that couldn't be bought, but could be earned through humility, respect, and recognition of the true value of people who cross our path when we need them most. Sister Grace Miller had trod a completely different path before finding her religious calling, a journey that had begun 20 years earlier at one of the country's most prestigious universities. Graduating in physical therapy with a specialization in neurorehabilitation, she had been considered one of the brightest students in her class, known for her tireless dedication to her studies and her natural ability to understand the complex mechanisms of the human nervous system. During college, Grace spent entire nights in the library studying anatomy, neurophysiology, and advanced rehabilitation techniques, driven by a genuine desire to help people who had lost motor functions due to accidents or degenerative diseases. Her professors frequently commented on Grace's exceptional talent for identifying and treating neurological injuries that other professionals considered lost causes. She had developed her own techniques, combining traditional methods with innovative approaches she studied in international medical journals. During her mandatory internships, Grace achieved surprising results with patients whom other students had classified as hopeless cases. Her thesis on neural reactivation through specific stimulation had been awarded and even published in a scientific journal, establishing her as a rising star in the field of neurorehabilitation even before graduation. After graduation, Grace was immediately hired by a private clinic that served high-income patients, where she quickly established herself as one of the most sought-after physical therapists in the city. Her extraordinary results attracted patients from all over the country, willing to pay any amount for her specialized services. For 5 years, Grace built a solid and lucrative career, accumulating enough financial resources to open her own clinic and expand her treatment methods to a larger number of people. She was recognized by colleagues as an exceptional professional and had a brilliant future ahead in the world of private medicine. However, a transformative experience completely changed the course of Grace's life when she was still 28 years old. During volunteer work at a public hospital, she met Mary, a 60-year-old woman who had suffered a stroke and could not afford specialized physical therapy. Grace began treating Mary for free on weekends, applying the same advanced techniques she used with private patients. Over months of treatment, she witnessed not only Mary's physical recovery, but also the deep gratitude and emotional transformation that her work provided for the patient's entire family. This experience awakened a spiritual restlessness in Grace that gradually grew until it became an absolute certainty that her life's mission went far beyond professional and financial success. She began to question whether she was using her talents in the most meaningful way possible, feeling called to a broader and more dedicated life of service. Grace began attending spiritual retreats and participating in volunteer work more frequently, always bringing her medical knowledge to underprivileged communities that would never have access to specialized treatments. The decision to enter religious life was not made impulsively, but matured over 2 years of deep reflection and prayer. Grace realized that her true calling was to use her talents to serve those most in need, without the limitations imposed by the private healthcare system that only served those who could pay. She sold all her possessions, donating a large portion of the money to charities, and entered the convent with the determination to continue practicing her profession, but now as a mission of faith instead of a commercial career. During her 15 years of religious life, Sister Grace had never lost her technical skills, continuing to study and update herself on advancements in neurorehabilitation through scientific publications she could access in the convent library. She applied her knowledge discreetly during hospital visits, always voluntarily and without ever charging for her services. Often, the hospital doctors themselves informally sought her out for advice on complex cases, recognizing her expertise even without fully understanding how a nun could possess such advanced medical knowledge. Her current life represented the perfect synthesis of scientific knowledge and spiritual dedication, a combination that allowed Grace to offer something very rare: hope based on both faith and real technical competence. The months that followed Edward's accident were marked by progressive isolation that transformed his luxurious mansion into a gilded prison where he sought refuge from a reality he refused to accept. The man who once commanded meetings with hundreds of people and made decisions that moved millions of dollars now spent entire days without speaking to anyone, communicating only through written messages when absolutely necessary. His secretary had been instructed to cancel all in-person meetings, and Edward conducted his business exclusively by phone and video conference, always positioning the camera so his wheelchair wouldn't appear on screen. Edward's suffering was not only physical but deeply emotional and psychological, a pain that manifested in how he had become even more cruel and demanding with everyone around him. Mansion staff were fired for trivial reasons, lucrative contracts were cancelled on momentary whims, and Edward developed an unhealthy obsession with maintaining absolute control over every aspect of his life he could still control. He had expensive elevators installed throughout the house, renovated bathrooms with special equipment, and hired private nurses who were changed weekly because Edward couldn't stand the same people witnessing his vulnerability repeatedly. Nights were the most difficult times for Edward, when the silence of the mansion amplified the echo of his own breathing, and he was left alone with thoughts he refused to share with any mental health professional. He spent hours looking at his immobile legs, trying to force some movement through sheer willpower, as if the determination that had built his empire could also heal his spinal cord. Edward even went so far as to shout commands at his legs, as if they were disobedient employees who needed to be intimidated back to work. During this period of isolation, Edward completely distanced himself from anyone who could represent a genuine emotional connection. He cancelled dinners with the few friends he still kept in touch with, interrupted romantic relationships that were beginning to blossom before the accident, and even avoided speaking with his elderly mother, who called daily worried about his condition. Edward had created an impenetrable emotional barrier around himself, convinced that any display of vulnerability would be interpreted as weakness by competitors who were certainly waiting for an opportunity to attack his business empire. Edward's anger manifested in increasingly destructive ways. including episodes where he hurled expensive objects against the walls of his office or shouted insults at employees who tried to help him with basic daily tasks. He had categorically refused to do any conventional physical therapy, claiming that the professionals were incompetent and that their techniques were too primitive for someone of his social standing. Edward fired 3 renowned physical therapists in a matter of weeks, always claiming they didn't understand the gravity and complexity of his case. Edward's isolation also included a systematic refusal to accept spiritual visits, having expelled priests, pastors, and other religious figures who tried to offer comfort during his first months of recovery. He viewed any attempt at spiritual support as a confirmation that his situation was terminal and that people had already given up on him. Edward interpreted prayers and blessings as signs that others believed he needed to prepare for death, an idea that enraged him because it contradicted his combative nature and his absolute refusal to accept defeat in any aspect of life. The mansion where Edward lived had become a physical reflection of his emotional state, silent, cold, and magnificently decorated, yet completely devoid of human warmth and genuine connections. Employees moved through the house like ghosts, performing their tasks in silence and avoiding any unnecessary eye contact with the boss who had become a bitter and resentful version of himself. Edward had created a world where he was simultaneously the absolute king and the solitary prisoner, surrounded by luxury but isolated from anything that could remind him of his lost humanity. When doctors suggested he be admitted for observation and more intensive treatment, Edward initially refused, but eventually agreed only because the hospital offered a level of privacy and control that he considered acceptable for his current condition. In the weeks following his encounter with Sister Grace, Edward experienced changes that went far beyond the physical sensations she had awakened in his legs. The technique applied by the nun had reactivated not only dormant nerve endings, but also a spark of hope Edward thought he had lost forever. He began to perceive that the sensations in his legs, though still limited, were real and consistent, manifesting especially during periods of greater concentration and relaxation. Edward began dedicating daily hours to trying to reproduce the movements Sister Grace had made, studying each gesture she had applied with a determination he hadn't shown in months. Edward's transformation did not go unnoticed by the hospital staff, who noticed a significant change in his behavior after the nun's visit. He had stopped shouting at nurses and doctors, begun asking technical questions about his condition instead of simply demanding impossible solutions, and showed genuine curiosity about treatments he had previously summarily rejected. Edward even went so far as to apologize to some professionals he had treated poorly in previous weeks, a gesture that surprised everyone because it completely contradicted the arrogant behavior pattern he had maintained since his admission. When Sister Grace returned for a second visit the following week, Edward received her with a completely different attitude. Instead of the hostility and contempt he had shown in their first encounter, he showed respectful curiosity about her knowledge and a willingness to learn that revealed a nascent humility. Edward asked about her training, about the techniques she had applied, and about the real possibilities of improvement in his condition. He listened attentively as she explained basic concepts about neuroplasticity and the nervous system's ability to create new connections even after severe injuries. During these conversations, Edward began to understand that Sister Grace possessed deep technical knowledge that went far beyond anything he had expected to find in a nun. She spoke about neural anatomy with the precision of a specialist, but always connected her scientific explanations with a perspective of faith that Edward found simultaneously comforting and disconcerting. Grace explained that she saw her work as a way to channel both her medical knowledge and her religious faith to offer real hope based on scientifically sound possibilities, not on empty promises or fantastical miracles. The evolution of the relationship between Edward and Sister Grace became a gradual process of rebuilding the self-esteem and hope Edward had lost. She began visiting him twice a week, applying increasingly advanced neural stimulation techniques, and teaching him specific exercises he could do on his own to maximize his chances of recovery. Edward discovered that he responded better to treatments when he maintained a positive mental attitude, something Sister Grace constantly emphasized through conversations about patience, perseverance, and the importance of celebrating small progress instead of getting frustrated with limitations. As the weeks passed, Edward began to experience incremental but consistent improvements in his condition. The sensations in his legs became more defined and frequent. He could voluntarily contract some specific muscles and even felt a gradual return of perception in certain areas that had been completely numb. Sister Grace explained that these improvements did not guarantee a complete recovery, but represented encouraging signs that his spinal cord had not been irreversibly damaged, as doctors had initially diagnosed. Most significant for Edward was the emotional transformation that accompanied his physical improvement. He had rediscovered the ability to feel genuine gratitude, especially towards Sister Grace, who dedicated her time and knowledge without asking for anything in return. Edward began to question many of the beliefs he had held throughout his life about people's worth, being directly related to the money they possessed or the social status they held. He realized he was learning lessons about humanity and compassion through a woman who had voluntarily renounced material wealth to dedicate herself to serving others. Edward also began to take an interest in Sister Grace's personal story, intrigued by how someone with her technical qualifications had chosen religious life instead of a lucrative career in private medicine. Their conversations evolved from purely technical discussions about treatment to deeper reflections on purpose, calling, and what truly matters in a person's life. After 6 weeks of treatment with Sister Grace, Edward experienced a decisive moment that confirmed his most optimistic hopes for his recovery. During a particularly intense neural stimulation session, he managed to voluntarily move the toes of his right foot for the first time since the accident, a small but unequivocal movement that brought tears to his eyes. Edward looked at Sister Grace with a gratitude so profound that it transcended any form of material payment he could imagine. In that moment of revelation, he understood that he was in front of someone who had literally given hope back to his life and felt an irresistible need to reciprocate in some meaningful way. Edward had spent decades believing that any problem could be solved through adequate financial compensation, and his first reaction was to try to apply this philosophy to his relationship with Sister Grace. He began by calculating how much he would pay any specialist in the world who could achieve similar results, reaching astronomical figures that reflected both the rarity of her talents and the importance his recovery held for him. Edward spent nights crafting increasingly generous proposals, convinced that he would find a sum that would be irresistible even to someone who had chosen religious life. When Edward finally made his formal offer the following week, he had prepared a carefully structured speech where he explained that he wanted to reciprocate, not only for the results already achieved, but to hire her exclusive services to continue the treatment until his complete recovery. He offered $1 million as an initial payment, plus a monthly salary equivalent to what the best neurosurgeons in the country received, in addition to extra benefits that included state-of-the-art medical equipment she could use for other patients. Edward presented the proposal with the same seriousness and professionalism he used in his biggest business negotiations. Sister Grace listened to the entire offer in silence with the same serene patience she demonstrated during her treatments, but Edward could see in her eyes a sadness that completely disconcerted him. When he finished speaking, she remained quiet for a few minutes, as if she was carefully choosing her words for a response that wouldn't hurt his feelings, but would make her position clear. Grace gently explained that her decision to enter religious life included vows that prevented her from accepting material compensation for any type of work, and that using her medical knowledge for personal gain would fundamentally contradict the principles that guided her calling. Edward initially tried to argue that the money could be donated to charities instead of being used for her personal benefit, but Sister Grace clarified that the issue was not the final destination of the funds, but the fact that she had consciously chosen a life where her skills are offered freely as a form of spiritual service. She explained that accepting payment, even for noble purposes, would transform her religious mission into a commercial transaction, fundamentally altering the nature of her dedication and compromising her spiritual integrity in a way she was not willing to consider. Sister Grace's refusal was a revealing moment for Edward, who for the first time in his adult life encountered someone who could not be convinced, bought, or persuaded through progressively larger financial offers. He realized he was facing a form of integrity that completely transcended his previous understanding of human motivations. Edward began to understand that Grace was not rejecting his offers out of pride or because she considered the amounts insufficient, but because she had found something more valuable than any material compensation, a purpose that gave deep meaning to her existence. However, Sister Grace did not leave Edward without alternatives to express his gratitude in a meaningful way. She mentioned that she had studied physical therapy with an exceptional colleague who now directed a specialized neurorehabilitation clinic and would be perfectly qualified to continue the treatment she had started. Grace explained that her friend, Dr. Ricardo Gomez, had specialized in the same techniques she used, but had also developed his own methods that could lead Edward to even greater levels of recovery than those already achieved. She offered to make the contact and recommend Edward as a patient, ensuring he would receive continuous treatment from someone equally competent, but who could accept appropriate professional compensation. Sister Grace's suggestion represented an elegant solution that respected both her religious calling and Edward's legitimate need to properly reciprocate for the care received. Dr. Ricardo Gomez arrived at the hospital 3 days after Sister Grace's contact, bringing with him an impressive reputation and a folder full of success stories that documented his experience in advanced neurorehabilitation. Tall, dark-haired, in his early 40s, with a confident smile that inspired immediate trust, Ricardo had specialized in the United States after his initial training in Brazil, returning to the country with innovative techniques that combined traditional approaches with cutting-edge technologies. Edward watched attentively as Ricardo examined his medical records and spoke with Sister Grace about the progress already made, noting the respectful way both professionals discussed his case with deep technical knowledge and genuine concern. During the first consultation, Dr. Ricardo confirmed Sister Grace's observations about Edward's recovery potential and explained that the techniques she had applied had created a solid foundation for more intensive and specialized treatments. He described a rehabilitation protocol that included functional electrical stimulation equipment, specialized aquatic therapy, and neuroplasticity techniques that could be applied over a period of 6 to 12 months. Ricardo explained that, although he couldn't guarantee complete recovery, the neurological signs Edward already demonstrated indicated real possibilities of recovering significant motor functions, possibly including the ability to walk with assistance. Edward was impressed not only by Dr. Ricardo's technical competence, but also by his human and realistic approach to treatment expectations. Unlike previous doctors who had been excessively pessimistic or unrealistically optimistic, Ricardo presented a plan based on solid scientific evidence and documented results with patients in similar conditions. He showed videos of other patients who had progressed from complete paralysis to assisted mobility, emphasizing that success would depend on both Edward's dedication and the consistent application of appropriate techniques. The most emotional moment of the first treatment session with Dr. Ricardo happened when Edward managed to voluntarily contract his right thigh muscles for the first time since the accident, a movement that was detected and amplified by the specialized equipment Ricardo had brought. The contraction was weak, but it represented a direct communication between Edward's brain and muscles he had considered dead forever. Ricardo explained that this was a crucial milestone in recovery, indicating that the neural pathways were not completely severed and that there was real potential for substantial improvements with adequate treatment. In the following weeks, Edward established an intensive treatment routine that included daily sessions with Dr. Ricardo. Combined with specific exercises, he practiced independently several times a day. The progress was gradual but consistent. First came stronger and more controlled muscle contractions, then more defined sensations of touch and pressure, and eventually small but coordinated movements that suggested recovery of basic motor functions. Edward documented each small victory in a journal that became a source of motivation on the most difficult days of treatment. Dr. Ricardo also introduced elements of aquatic therapy that proved particularly effective for Edward, who discovered that flotation in water allowed movements that were impossible on dry land. During sessions in Ricardo's clinic's therapeutic pool, Edward managed to move his legs in a coordinated way for the first time in months, an experience he described as being reborn. The water offered an environment where he could experience the sensation of mobility without the full weight of his body, creating a neurological bridge that facilitated the reconnection between mental intention and muscular response. After 2 months of intensive treatment, Edward experienced the moment that would change his life forever. With the aid of support devices and under Dr. Ricardo's constant supervision, he managed to stand up and take 3 consecutive steps. The steps were unstable and required significant support, but they represented the achievement of something all previous doctors had declared impossible. Edward wept openly at that moment, not only for the physical achievement, but for the understanding that his life had been literally saved by the intervention and dedication of people who genuinely cared about his well-being. The relationship between Edward and Dr. Ricardo evolved beyond a typical professional bond, developing into a friendship based on mutual respect and shared goals. Ricardo admired the determination and discipline Edward brought to his recovery process, while Edward deeply respected Ricardo's competence and dedication to his work. 6 months after meeting Sister Grace, Edward had progressed from a state of complete paralysis to being able to walk short distances with the aid of a specialized cane, a transformation that exceeded even Dr. Ricardo's most optimistic expectations. The recovery was not just physical, but represented a complete revolution in how Edward viewed the world around him. The man who once measured people's worth by the wealth they possessed now deeply understood that life's greatest riches could not be bought nor sold, but only recognized and valued by those wise enough to see them. Edward observed his own legs walking down the St. Joseph's Hospital corridor with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude that accompanied him with every step he took. He vividly remembered the moment he had offered $1 million to Sister Grace with a cruel laugh, and how that same amount now seemed insignificant compared to the true value of what she had done for him. Sister Grace had not only reactivated neural connections in his legs, but had also reactivated his lost humanity, teaching him lessons about compassion, humility, and gratitude that no business school in the world could have offered. Edward's decision to offer the money had matured over months of reflection on how he could adequately repay not only Sister Grace, but also express his gratitude in a way that honored the personal transformation he had experienced. He didn't simply want to make an ordinary charitable donation, but to create something significant that reflected both his gratitude and his new understanding of what truly matters in life. Edward spent weeks developing a plan that would combine his personal gratitude with a lasting legacy that could help others in situations similar to those he had faced. When Edward finally presented his proposal to Sister Grace, he did so with a humility and sincerity that contrasted drastically with the arrogance he had shown in their first encounters. He explained that he wanted to donate $1 million, not as payment for services rendered, but as an acknowledgement that she had saved his life in a way that transcended any commercial transaction. Edward emphasized that his gratitude could not be quantified in monetary terms, but that he felt a deep need to transform this gratitude into something concrete that could multiply the kind of hope she had brought into his life. Sister Grace initially resisted the idea of accepting such a substantial donation, not because of the amount itself, but because she feared that Edward was feeling overly obligated to repay her for something she had done voluntarily as part of her vocation. She explained that her greatest reward had already been witnessing his transformation, both physical and emotional, and that seeing Edward recover not only his mobility, but also the ability to demonstrate genuine gratitude was more valuable than any material compensation could be. Edward persisted in his proposal, explaining that the donation represented much more than personal gratitude. It was a way to multiply the impact she had had on his life, allowing other people in similar situations to benefit from the same kind of hope and specialized care that had transformed his existence. He had developed a specific plan to use the money to create facilities that would combine advanced medical treatment with the humanized approach that Sister Grace represented, creating a model of care that would honor both her technical expertise and her spiritual dedication. The conversation between Edward and Sister Grace about the donation evolved into a broader discussion about legacy, purpose, and the responsibility that people with resources have to use their wealth in a way that significantly benefits society. Edward admitted that he had spent decades accumulating money primarily to satisfy his ego and demonstrate power, but that his experience had taught him that true fulfillment came from using resources to create a positive impact on the lives of others. Sister Grace eventually agreed to accept the donation, but only on the condition that Edward was genuinely committed to the long-term project and that he remained personally involved to ensure that the resources were used consistently with the values she represented. She wanted to be sure that the donation was not just a momentary manifestation of gratitude, but part of a permanent transformation in how Edward viewed his social responsibility and his ability to contribute positively to the world. The project that was born from Edward's generosity and Sister Grace's wisdom transformed into something much greater than either of them had initially imagined. The donated money was used to create not just a clinic, but a network of 3 neurological rehabilitation centers that combined cutting-edge medical technology with a humanized approach inspired by the philosophy of care that Sister Grace represented. Each center was designed to offer free or subsidized treatment for patients who could not afford specialized rehabilitation, breaking the cycle where only wealthy people had access to the best available treatments. Dr. Charles Thompson was invited to direct the first center, located in the city where it all began, and he brought with him a team of professionals who shared his vision of medicine based on both technical competence and genuine concern for the holistic well-being of patients. The center was equipped with the same neural stimulation devices and therapeutic pools that had been fundamental to Edward's recovery, but also included spaces for psychological counseling, social work, and spiritual care, recognizing that true healing often requires more than just medical intervention. Sister Grace accepted the invitation to be a spiritual counselor for the centers, a role that allowed her to continue offering emotional support and guidance to patients without violating her religious vows. She developed a visitation program that combined elements of pastoral counseling with basic education on neuroplasticity and recovery expectations, helping patients and families maintain realistic hope during the most challenging periods of treatment. Her work at the centers became legendary among patients who frequently cited her words of encouragement as crucial factors in their own recoveries. Edward took an active role in the administration of the centers, applying his business skills to ensure that resources were used efficiently and that the quality of care was maintained at the highest possible standards. He began dedicating at least 20 hours a week to the centers, developing partnerships with universities for training new professionals, negotiating advantageous contracts for equipment acquisition, and establishing protocols that ensured long-term financial sustainability. Edward discovered that applying his negotiation and management skills for humanitarian purposes provided much greater satisfaction than any commercial business had ever offered. The impact of the centers quickly exceeded initial expectations, with waiting lists demonstrating the enormous demand for accessible neurological rehabilitation services. In the first 2 years of operation, over 500 patients received treatment at the 3 centers, with success rates that competed with the best private institutions in the world. Many of these patients were people who had been told by doctors that they would never walk again, but who achieved some degree of recovery through the combination of advanced techniques and careful support that characterized the centers. The stories of transformation that emerged from the centers created a ripple effect in the national and international medical community, attracting visits from specialists who wanted to study the unique model developed by Edward, Sister Grace, and Dr. Charles Thompson. The model was eventually documented and published in medical journals as an example of how financial resources could be combined with professional expertise and spiritual guidance to create rehabilitation programs more effective than purely technical or purely assistance-based approaches. Edward also established a scholarship fund that allowed young people from low-income families to study physical therapy and neurorehabilitation on the condition that they dedicated at least 3 years of their initial career working at the centers or in other institutions serving underserved populations. This program created a pipeline of qualified professionals who shared the humanitarian values of the founders and ensured that the legacy of the centers would continue even when Edward and the other founders were no longer actively involved. Edward's personal transformation became evident to everyone who interacted with him at the centers, where patients and staff frequently commented on his humility, patience, and genuine interest in their recovery stories. The same man who once measured success purely in financial terms now found his greatest satisfaction in witnessing small victories of patients who managed to move fingers or take their first steps after months of treatment. Edward often said that he had received much more from the centers than he had donated, because they had taught him lessons about purpose and fulfillment that no amount of wealth could have provided. The legacy of the centers expanded beyond direct patient treatment to include collaborative research with universities, training programs for healthcare professionals, and advocacy for public policies that increased access to neurorehabilitation services nationwide. 5 years after that cruel laugh echoed through the St. Joseph's Hospital room, Edward Blackwood stood on the balcony of one of the rehabilitation centers he had helped create, observing patients taking their first steps with the same specialized equipment that had been fundamental to his own recovery. His now graying hair reflected not only the passage of time, but also the wisdom he had acquired through a journey that completely transformed his understanding of what constitutes true success in life. Edward walked without the aid of a cane, though he still maintained a slight limp that he considered a blessing as a reminder of how far he had come, not only physically, but in terms of personal growth. Sister Grace continued her regular visits to the centers, now recognized as an almost legendary figure among staff and patients who knew her simply as the nun who performs miracles. Her methods had been documented and taught to generations of therapists, but she insisted that true miracles happened when people discovered their own capacity for healing and growth. Sister Grace frequently said that her greatest joy came from witnessing not only physical recovery, but emotional and spiritual transformations that often surprised the patients themselves and their families. Dr. Charles Thompson had developed innovative techniques that combined the fundamental methods he learned from Sister Grace with technological advancements that continued to expand possibilities for patients with spinal cord injuries. He now directed a network of centers that extended to 5 states, all operating under the principles of technical excellence, combined with the humanitarian approach that had characterized the original project. Charles frequently credited his professional success to lessons learned by observing the partnership between Edward and Sister Grace, which had taught him that true healing required attention to both physical needs and emotional and spiritual well-being. Edward's transformation had been so complete that former business associates frequently commented that he seemed like a completely different person, someone who had maintained his intelligence and determination, but had gained empathy and humility that made all interactions with him more meaningful. Edward still ran his company, but had restructured his approach to focus on projects that contributed positively to communities, preferring sustainable development over quick profits and maintaining work cultures that prioritized employee well-being alongside financial performance. The legacy of the rehabilitation centers had grown well beyond original expectations, serving as a model that was replicated in other countries and inspiring health policies that increased access to specialized treatment regardless of patients' economic circumstances. Research conducted at the centers had contributed to advancements in the understanding of neuroplasticity that benefited patients worldwide, while training programs had graduated hundreds of professionals who carried humanitarian values into their work in various settings. Sister Grace frequently reflected that her decision to leave a lucrative career had led to much greater impacts than she could have achieved working with individual patients. Through her partnership with Edward and Dr. Charles Thompson, she had helped create systems that multiplied her ability to bring hope and healing to thousands of people. She remained grateful that Edward's initial mockery had been transformed into a genuine partnership that honored both scientific knowledge and spiritual wisdom as essential components of comprehensive healing. Edward frequently told visitors that knowing Sister Grace had taught him that true wealth consisted not in accumulating money, but in using available resources to create positive changes that lasted beyond individual lives. He had discovered that donating money strategically could generate much more satisfying returns than any business had provided, because these returns were measured in transformed lives instead of digits in bank accounts. The story that began with cruel laughter and desperate defiance had evolved into a testament to the power of forgiveness, humility, and the recognition that every person carries the potential to contribute something valuable to the world. Edward's transformation from arrogant millionaire to humanitarian leader demonstrated that even people who seem most hardened by success can discover new purposes when they encounter others who embody genuine service and wisdom.